or is that a comment on expectation? I mean, can thought only be measured by what is said and who says it, or might the group in fact be very active but less dominant, or apparently less engaged or less verbal, but maybe being equally thoughtful? There is action involved in the process of digestion, metabolizing, thinking, reading, discussing, commenting, which may appear to be less thoughtful, less active, but maybe not, depending on how one seeks to measure that or think about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in this group, we're paying because you have more knowledge, I would think. At least I think you have more than me about this issue. So in some ways, I am hoping that you share something with me that I don't already know. So maybe things are more, they're not all as linear and cut and dried as maybe they seem to be. Maybe things all blend together a little bit more.
All right. So I think at this point we might bring in a concept that you're talking about without naming it, that is group mentality. Right? Which is group mentality. I think this is what you, Tamara, were saying, right? That the group mentality can be assessed in relation to what the group is, under what assumption the group is operating, right? The fact that in a group there might be one member that is more experienced than others doesn't make necessarily of that group a basic assumption of dependence group, but it may, right? But that depends on the group mentality. If the group would take the fact that there is someone who's more experienced as a agreement that we can all sit back, right, and have this one member think and talk for all of us, and then we just learn what is being said, that would be a group mentality where the basic assumption of dependence is prevailing, is operating. The work group is in the background, the work group mentality is in the background, and the other two basic assumptions, the pairing group assumptions and the fight-flight, is also in the background. If the group thinks that the one member that has more experience can guide them and stimulate them and orient them to do the work, and they're willing to do the work, that's a work group, right? But you wouldn't define it by the fact that there is one who's more experienced than the other. It's rather but what the expectations or the mentality is. Right? Certainly in large groups, let's say universities where people have these massive master classes, it's necessarily operating under the basic assumption of dependence. You sit there in a class of 40, 50, 80 people, you sit there and you let someone expose what he already knows, and you sit back. The learning will come at a later moment, probably not in that moment. And everybody agrees that we'll hold on to that system, even if it's a pretty awful system to learn, right?
So would you just say that the work group purpose here isn't to listen to you tell us about Bion and us get more knowledgeable, but sort of to think with you or to think together about whatever is being discussed?
Yes, right.
More of an active process than
exactly,
a passive one.
Right. And perhaps as also being aware, and that links to what you were saying, right, that we may unwillingly, unwittingly fall into a basic assumption of dependence group. But if we know that that may occur, that the basic assumption of dependence is underlying, even in the moments that we're working the hardest, knowing that that exists, will make us sensitive to observe when it happens, right? That is why I was challenging you and saying momentarily or forever. Well, momentarily, because it's going to be there all the time, but the knowledge, right, is going to allow us to be sensitive to observe, if we will. That is what Caper was saying the other day, you see, and in line with Bion, of course, that psychoanalysis, rather than cure neurosis or a psychosis, what it does is it gives the analysand the tools to better observe himself and to better observe his neurosis when it interferes or when it comes to happen, to better understand himself.
And space to think about it.
And the space to think about, right,
Yeah.
exactly, right, yes. Now let us see what about the other two basic assumptions.
I was wondering, that was where I was going to go. I understand a little bit more the one of pairing, because I understand that two people may start talking together in a group like a couple, and with the hope that somehow they're going to find together the solution rather than look to one leader. But I don't understand. I'm trying to imagine how the fight-flight basic assumptions may appear. I mean, would that be like like the group getting together against the leader and seeing the leader as a threat, and then developing a kind of paranoid attitude toward the leader, or could it appear in different ways? I was trying to imagine that. And I'm going to stay quiet because it sounds so noisy.
Yes, it's very noisy. I don't know why. There's moments. Okay, it's quieter now, right? Well, let's see. I want to go through the both basic assumptions to see if there is an agreement with what Judy says, or does anybody have some other understanding? Let us take one at a time. Pairing.
Pairing.
I'm just repeating what I remember from the book. I don't know that I know much more than just that it's something about the fantasy that there could be a creative couple that emerges in the group, and then from that creative synthesis, some other product is promised in fantasy, but not actually ever realized. The messianic idea, yeah. And that's, I don't really understand it very much, except it's some sort of group iteration of an Oedipal fantasy.
Uh-huh.
I guess my understanding is that somehow two persons in the group somehow unconsciously align, and the idea is that the others in the group become aware of that and then have the fantasy that those two will produce something that will be helpful to the group, kind of save the group from its dilemma, more or less.
Right, yes, all right.
I do recall him mentioning the idea that those that are chosen don't necessarily become the couple for obvious reasons of superior knowledge, or he mentioned an example of someone becoming one of the pairings because they were able to allow themselves to be used to express some kind of group emotion that needed expression, I think.
Yes.
Just make that comment.
He also mentions that it's sexual, even if it doesn't have to be man, woman, but whatever gender, and that maybe that's part of the creation but the sexual union is creating this fantasy that will save the group. So that sexual part, I don't know how he meant to interpret that, but that's how I see it.
Well, let's see. I think the background to that could be that the fact that sex exists and that people relate sexually and have babies saves humanity. If that were not there, we would have been long erased from this planet, you see. I think another example that Bion must have had in mind when he spoke of the messianic idea is in the history of religion, right, in Catholicism, that Jesus was there, was the Messiah that had as his task to save humanity, to redeem human beings from their sins. That's why he calls it the messianic idea, right? The birth of the messianic idea. That is the hope that if there is not a leader, Moses would be an example of a leader, right? Of a group of dependents, right? Moses saved the Jewish people by bringing them out of slavery. We're going to celebrate that this next weekend, right? This weekend, it's Passover, Jewish Passover. They're bringing them out from slavery and from Egypt and to become themselves and so on and so forth, right? So he was the leader of dependents and they just followed him. And then he brought the Ten Commandments down from God, so he was a representative of God on earth. Now, Jesus was different because Jesus was born out of a couple, right? The couple of Virgin Mary with God, and he was the Son of God, and he came there to save humanity. So Jesus was not a leader, nor were the parents the leaders, but the parents, God and the Virgin Mary, were there to create this messianic solution that things would be fine ever after, right? And this is the way it is. I mean, the group always tries to preserve the group. How are we going to do to survive? Well, maybe if we find a leader who's going to tell us what we have to do, if the leader knows we're going to survive, that would be one way. Another way is, well, if we expect, right, some hypothetical pair to find an idea that would help us survive, well, maybe then things will be fine ever after, right? In political life, I think that diplomacy is based on that. There is some messianic hope that diplomats would find a solution to help us all to share the planet in peace, right? To love each other, to stop the wars, stop famine, and all the malaises that afflict human beings. Of course, that never happened and will never happen, but there is a messianic hope, and diplomacy rests on that. The schools of diplomats, universities, right? People that get trained to be diplomats, and all that, and we all have the hope. We have the hope that Hillary Clinton will, together with Obama, save us from the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, the September 11th not to happen again, and so on and so forth. Deep down, I don't think that we believe that neither her nor anybody else will be able to do that. But we have this messianic hope, the hope that they will come when this will happen. And what Bion says is that the messianic hope is based on the fact that it doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. It's just a basic assumption. Exactly, right?
What did you say?
That it is unborn.
Oh.
Right? It's an unborn hope. It will never be born. Mm-hmm. Right? And when it gets born, it isn't that we, I mean, Jesus wasn't who we expected him to be. He didn't save humanity. Wars continued, things were going on everywhere, the Romans